Everything seems fine, happy, nice, clean, nice. Alrighty, when I first moved into this place, the lighting in this room was dingy and terrible. In fact, I'd like to say it would almost be a crime against humanity or a violation of the Geneva Conventions or something like that in a post-COVID world to furnish an apartment with lighting this terrible. Now, of course, everything in here seems fine now, and that's because I had to install my own bit of kit right here. So let's talk about that. Of course, good lighting is key to any good model railroad, especially if you're trying to build one with some amount of museum quality or just want the room to look nicer, to feel nicer, what have you. But there's little point in making all of those details if you can't see any of it. So to that end, I recycled, once again, waste not, want not, I recycled the light fixtures from my last layout. Now, if you'll remember, that layout was in a roughly 15 by 30 foot room. And so the amount of lighting that it took for that room to be adequate in a space this small, 10 by 12, is an abundance. So I've actually got a few lights that I'm not using, or I've repurposed them into studio lights for photography and video and stuff like that. Which is why you can see my face, even though the lights are below me. I've got other lights above me here. So mounting these things was pretty straightforward. The one thing I had to do, though, was make sure that I could keep things rather even, and to that end, I ended up using 2x2 blocks, basically leftover bits of table legs, and mounted them behind the front of the fascia work right here, and they're just the right width for these single line T5 style fluorescent fixtures. And that allowed me a nice flat mounting spot behind these fixtures for another project that I'm looking into. But I wanted to make sure that the top of the fixture was even with the underside of the valance framing here, because while they might be nice and straight on these pieces right here, when you get into the corners, they actually have to cut across the framework in a way that wouldn't allow them to tuck up underneath that stuff. Now, they seem to be sticking out rather far now, but once you start adding some masonite and you start bringing the fascia down on the valance, that will then shade everything heading out into the aisle and focus all the light onto the layout surface itself. Now, as far as wiring these things up, what I ended up doing, which was similar to what I did in the last place, was I made basically a very durable extension cord. So I bought about half a dozen cheap electrical sockets. I think I got the 15 amp variant because we're dealing with these LED fluorescents. They are not high draw critters. I think I can put 10 of them in a row and not exceed the rating for just one outlet. So that's the great thing about these LED fluorescents, is they are very, very efficient. But I basically just rigged up a series of basic electrical sockets, strung them together with some 14 gauge, basically that armor jacketed stuff, and basically just made a very durable extension cord with several outlets along the way. Now, if you're not comfortable coming up with something like that, and understand, it's not really high risk to put something like this together, because it's not wired into the house. Okay, I didn't hardwire anything. Like I said, it's an extension cord, so there are outlets, on the end and throughout, and it's fed by an ordinary 3-prong grounded plug. And everything is connected all the way through, ground to ground, white to white, black to black, all the way down the line. So theoretically, this thing could be bulletproof, but again, if you're not comfortable doing your own wiring, here's an alternative I might suggest. For very little money, you can go to the Home Depot or Lowe's or what have you and get these, they're like 6 to 8 foot long shop workbench power strips. And depending on what you get, they'll have a nice little outlet about every 12 inches or so. And in a situation like this, if I didn't want to wire up my own bit of kit here, then I could mount a few of these strategically around the room such that I could plug in each one of my valance fixtures into that setup and then operate those things either by plugging them directly into the nearest outlet when I want to turn on the train room lights, or if I want to do something more convenient, I could rig up one of those remote control light switch deals that you can use for table lamps and small appliances and things like that. And those are pretty cheap too. Now, these remote control lighting fixtures usually come 3 or 4 to a pack, and the really nice ones have a little handheld remote that you can select which outlet you want to light up, and thus which fixture. And you can use these things to supply however many power strips you have in order to supply your layout lighting. And as long as you don't lose the handheld remote, you can walk in the room, flip on the lights through a handheld, and carry on about your business. Also, it's important to understand how these light fixtures were constructed to begin with. Each one of these things is actually a fixture that's designed to be mounted in a proper utility box. So what I've done instead, let's try and turn this where the camera can see it, is I've taken a piece of basically extension cord stock and mounted that, wired that up inside here, put all the appropriate wire nuts and caps and everything on it. And then the other end of this, as I smack into the ceiling fan up there, the ceiling fan that will never be used in this space, the business end of that is a simple do-it-yourself extension cord plug end. And so that's the self-contained little package. These are, each one of the light fixtures is configured in this way, and then they plug into the nearest outlet in the wiring loom. So that's why I say this kind of a system can be easily adapted to like a shop power strip and some remote control light switches if you're not comfortable doing your own wiring. Me, I've been dealing with stuff like this ever since I was a kid, and I've made a couple of mistakes along the way, but I'm still here, so obviously I didn't shock myself to death. Knock on wood, plenty of that around here. But the point being, there are off-the-shelf options available for doing this stuff pretty inexpensively and still giving yourself the kind of flexibility you need to conform your lighting needs to whatever your layout shape is. So that's how I'm doing this. Now let's talk about the other thing that I wanted that flat surface on the back here, the little experiment I wanted to conduct. So one of the things you can't really see because it's mounted behind the main light strips is I have a series of blue LED light fixtures that I made for the old place in order to test out night lighting effects. And these actually run off the 12-volt rail of layout accessory power. And I might come up with a different way to do that just because that seems a little cumbersome and very dependent. Like I can't just switch this one thing to another because the entire power supply for the railroad has to go with it. But in any event, I made a bunch of 4-foot little light fixtures using some blue LED strip, soldered some jumper wires with power pole connectors on the ends of them so that the 4-foot lengths can be mounted behind these. They fire downward, they shot them at a downward angle to light up blue onto the vast majority of the layout. And you just connect the power pole connectors up inside the valance, and you can feed the entire smash from one end. Again, they're LEDs, they don't snorkel a lot of power. And yet in a nice, tight, controlled setting like this, you get plenty of bang for your buck and plenty of lumens for your buck. So that's something I've been playing around with. Ultimately, I would like to experiment with dimmable LED light strips and try and come up with some kind of a fixture or use RGB strips or something like that in order to come up with a way that I can go from bright white light like this and dim it down through magic hour to orange to red to purple to blue, so that you can actually not so fast that the eye sees it, but just very carefully gaslighting your visitors, very slowly crank the light temperature down to where you gently transition from bright white light down to nighttime. And if you've got a lot of buildings and streets and things like that, where a lot of cityscapes where a lot of expected lighting is happening. Porch lights on buildings, on houses, street lights, headlights on cars and trucks, and of course the lights on the locomotives. If you got any tall towers, the anti-aircraft beacons, all that interesting little stuff. Of course, really pops once you dial everything down to night lighting. So that's something I want to play around with as well. So I'm making accommodations for that to at least have the white and the blue. So I've got either end of that spectrum covered. Dimming between the two will have to be its own separate project. So anyway, that's the lighting on this railroad. And with all that stuff in place, now I have to start cutting lumber and getting ready for the track boards, the backdrops, and the other finish work on here before I start laying track. So we won't get too in the weeds on the finishing construction and all the heavy work that still needs to be done. We'll get to that in its own good time. Before then, I want to talk about the track plan, what inspired it, and what my hopes are both in the short term in this place and the possibilities for extending this beyond this particular living situation, and whether or not it might have a place in a future train layout. Till then, I'm Mike Lindsay. Thanks for coming out. My thinking behind how and why I mounted the lights where I did on the valance, and cover what this little pigtail is attached to, because that's its own neat little project. So stand by. We got a little stuff to look at.
Hey guys, stand by. We got a little stuff to look at.
And ultimately, what its short-term and long-term implications might be. So that resetting what I'm hoping to get out of it, and what the short-term and long-term implications of this build. Boy, that's really clumsy phrasing. What do I mean to say by that? There are implications. I just don't feel like that's the right word.
I'm gonna start doing this like Christopher Barnett. Let's all take a closer look.